Well, that was a very, very impressive program. I want to make a few observations which lead to questions and an expansion of what you were trying to do in the program and what you did do, and also, of course, ask about what the impact of this is, what you're looking for in your audience and in the world to which it's addressed. First, I guess partially because the Holocaust is extremely familiar to people in this country, and especially people who are Jewish. What struck me first was how descriptive the program was. It of course occurred to me that you felt this need to simply state the facts. First, the facts about the Holocaust itself, and also to give a somewhat clear and I think important definition of what it is. That is, it was surely a mass murder, and as you note, mass murders have occurred before and since. Of course, since I'm an Islamic historian, what popped into my head was the Mongol invasions, which were produced hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deaths. But we're different in this one respect, which you bring to the fore, which is, of course, they weren't modern, but the particular point was that their object was not to simply kill a particular people or and exterminate. It wasn't, the desire wasn't to exterminate. This was an attempted extermination, and it's unique in that respect, or was unique up to that time. We'll talk a little, perhaps, about what, so to speak, admirers of this objective have done since. But it was unique in that sense, and that's important to convey that, especially for the reasons that you mentioned, that people want to do kind of deal with it by doing comparisons which are not altogether appropriate. So it reminds me of how little really the facts are known. And I would, if I may expand a little bit, it reminds me a little bit of how little the facts of all kinds of things are known in the Arab world, and how much that has been a problem for Muslim thought and politics over the past, let's say, 50, 60 years, that there's been a great depreciation of the notion that there are, facts and arguments that need to be made, and so much of discourse is assertive. And there I was reminded, your discussion of the use that the peculiar way in which the Holocaust is dealt with. On one hand, you have denial, and other people affirm it and wish it had been complete. And sometimes, if I recall correctly, the people are the same. There are people who have both denied it and celebrated it. And that this particular kind of indifference to self-contradiction is itself also a problem with, but somehow the Holocaust is a subject which particularly solicits this kind of incoherence. And finally, that it turns out that people also notice that they think it's useful. The Holocaust is useful for advancing their agendas because they think Jews or Israel have profited from it. Those were my general observations, and I invite you to, but those are what struck me as terribly crucial in the program and for your audience, but also the concern that somehow the getting used to the idea that either it didn't happen or what difference does it make has some direct impact on people who are not Jews and not Israel, but have a powerful impact in places like your native Syria, Ammar, that we have I mean, they stopped counting the dead a long time ago, so it's probably closer to 1 million than it is to 500,000, and half the population has been moved around, and a kind of callousness to this kind of activity is, it certainly can harm Jews in Israel, but it harms it harms Arabs and Muslims themselves, and this is very crucial. I do want to note, and partially because it was mentioned in that there were, and this is another side that probably needs to be developed, but perhaps is worth developing, that there were rather decent and even heroic actions taken by Arabs during the Holocaust. And one of the people in books you cited was written by Rob Satloff, who's here with us today, and I would recommend people look at that as well, that there are, of course, discouraging examples, but there are also inspiring examples in this history. I'll stop there and then ask you, if you like, what your reaction to that is, but I'm particularly interested in what you think most needs to happen within about this subject, not merely from the question of the Holocaust itself, but from the point of view of regional discourse.
Let me just, before we even go into that, make a couple of acknowledgements that are necessary. The people at the Holocaust Museum were very, very supportive of the program, and I think this is the first time Mina is here from the Holocaust Museum. I think, and we really need to appreciate his effort. For the first time, the people at the Holocaust Museum allowed for the space to be used in this way, and for an actual TV program to be shot inside the museum. So this is
providing the material as well.
Providing the materials and helping consulting on the historical aspect of it. So they've really played a very important role in helping us develop the program.
Yeah, it's important to mention that. And also, when did they begin to develop the exhibit on Syria?
And this is actually the second acknowledgement, is that even though we, in the program itself, we said we shouldn't be comparing, that one of those aspects of trying to to co-opt the term Holocaust is by always comparing. There is a Holocaust happening here, there is a Holocaust happening there. So, but in this particular case, and as we noted at the end of the program, if there is an academic study that actually delves into a certain particular mass atrocity, it's not the idea of making direct connections and say, oh, this is another Holocaust, but this is a mass atrocity that needs to be condemned. So I think this is what the Holocaust Museum is trying to do as well, by opening itself to programs like ours, by creating a wing on the Syrian tragedy, but actually also right now doing things on Myanmar, is trying to say, okay, we want to prevent a recurrence. This is not just about memorialization of a certain event. The whole idea is to prevent recurrence of similar types of events. So this is very important for them, and we, in a sense, appreciate, as a Syrian, I appreciate very much the fact that they have done something that my people in Syria and a lot of Arabs still have problem doing, which is empathize with the other side. I have sort of a history with the whole concept of trying to combat sort of Holocaust denialism in Syria and the region in general. From the very early days of my activism career, in the late 1990s up until now, and I had an encounter on the internet. I was in Damascus, it was 2001, shortly after 9/11, and I had an encounter on the internet with a professor of anthropology called Eric Gans in UCLA, and he was a Jewish scholar. He focuses a lot on the Holocaust in the Middle East, but at the same time he's developed a sort of a branch of anthropology called generative anthropology. And he is also, politically speaking, an admitted neocon. So to me, by connecting with him, I was breaking so many taboos. I was in Syria connecting with someone who is clearly not a fan of the regime, and talking about the Holocaust and talking about the Arab-Israeli struggle from a very different perspective. And he's a neocon to boot. So, but we did have a long dialogue with him that was published on an internet website in Arabic at the time. And he himself published it on his own website. And in it, we discussed the idea of the Holocaust and Holocaust denialism. And to me, one of the things that came out of this is that this was such a clearly easy, morally speaking, event to take a stand on. I mean, there is nothing that I can see that can be political. I mean, the Jewish community didn't do anything to bring this upon themselves. You cannot say, oh, they committed this massacre that they, against the Germans, so they, made them do it. Or you cannot sort of pinpoint anything. Even if some people say, well, some of them refuse to assimilate. So what? Yeah, so it's such an easy thing to emphasize this and to say this is wrong, and yet it is so difficult for us to reach it in the region. And I always believe that the reason I focused on it in my writings at the time is because I saw a connection between a struggle for democracy, a struggle for liberation, and empathy. If we cannot empathize with others, no one is going to empathize with us. If you are not willing to, how can we build bridges with anyone in the world if you are not willing to show empathy? And this is something that I think our culture still struggles with to date. And I think the whole idea of trying to revisit the Holocaust again and do this program, which is, I think, the second program Alhurra did on the Holocaust. Roberts was the first to do a program on the Holocaust in Alhurra channel. But the whole idea is to try to break that taboo and to try to say, look, it's not a political stand. It's not a liberal stand. It's not a right-wing or left-wing stand. It's a humanist, moralist stand that we need to take because it does help us grow, in a sense, as people.
Why? I will give free rein to Sam in a minute, but what you just said about the difficulties of empathy, what do you attribute that? And I take it what you were saying was, I mean, the Holocaust is an example, but that it's a quality that has been difficult to nurture in.
We sort of, even in the interrelations between the different communities in Syria, in the region, Arabs don't sympathize with the Kurds, Sunnis don't sympathize with the Alawites, Muslims don't empathize with the Christians. There is a lack of empathy even among the different constituent communities of the region. It's not that it's limited to a particular group or a particular time. This seems to have been around for a while, and I frankly don't know. I wish Sam will be able to have some ideas on this issue. I don't understand it. I mean, and leave it to me, a person with autism, to try to explain the need for empathy for a culture. I mean, I understand it intellectually and the need of it. Emotionally, I have my own problems, but I don't know. Is our culture autistic? I have no idea. I mean, there is an internally built problem, it seems, in the way we address the world or we envision the world, that I'm still struggling to understand personally.
Sam.
I mean, you use the word descriptive. I think that captures it. Usually, I mean, we've aired so far 15 episodes. This is probably the only one of its kind. Usually, we are much more opinionated in the program. The whole idea of the program is to have these opinions out there that are not usually heard in the Arabic world, in the Arabic media. But in this case, obviously, it was very important to tell the audience what happened, because they have no idea. And because in the absence of knowledge, of course, people fill it with all kinds of conspiracy theories. I was telling you just as before we entered about the kind of reactions we're getting on social media by people who watched the episode. And it's basically everything we said and described the region as having. So, for example, we get comments of, okay, I'll do the math for you. There were 13,152 Jews in France. And I don't know, I love the precision. I mean, the exact figure. He counted them one by one and does the math. And then, yeah, the 6 million, that can be a true number. So in the absence of the knowledge of what actually
Even I can do that math.
there's all this kind of wrong information, conspiracy theories, all of that replacing it. So I think it was very important to basically explain what happened, especially as a lot of the conspiracy theories, the denialism is based on the figure itself, and that it cannot be all in the done in the extermination camps, and thus explaining that the Holocaust is a longer process. The Einsatzgruppen that went after the German troops and what they did, all these various steps, that it's not just one thing that we're talking about, that's the whole thing. The second thing is also to bring it to the region. I think it was very important to start by saying, why should we care? Because the typical reaction is, well, okay, that happened. I'll grant you that. Who cares? Why should I, as an Arab, as an Egyptian, as whatever, care? So making that case of why people should care about this and linking the question to the Arabs and the Holocaust, explaining, I think Mina works in the Holocaust Museum, part of his work is highlighting how the Arabic media at the time of the Holocaust covered the event. So how come your media today denies it if the media at the time was covering what was going on? They covered the Nuremberg laws, they covered all of these, they reported about the news of the camps as they were coming out from Poland. All of that exists in the Arabic media in 44 and 45 and 47. Why? How come you deny it today? So highlighting all of these things, I think, was very important for the audience who doesn't have any other chance, basically, to know this information.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually, you see in the program, that we began by stating our position. In the very beginning, we said that there is a double standard here and there needs to change. We usually end by the position. We sort of list a fact, you have an argument, and we end by having a position statement. We started by a position statement on the Holocaust because we wanted to shock people, and we wanted them to know clearly where we stand. That they are going to hear a program that's going to marshal facts that are designed to help them overcome what we said is a double standard on their part, on our part in the region. So I think it's beyond marshalling facts, and that may not be sufficient by itself. In order to be able to break that barrier, there is something else that needs to be done. And I'm still, once again, this is one of those issues that I'm struggling with, because there are certain precepts in our culture that has proven very difficult to change, even 100 years after a variety of attempts at modernization have been made. I do not know.
What do you have in mind there?
Well, I mean, in addition to having this kind of lack of empathy for others and a belief in conspiracy theories, we still don't really are willing to accept that we are not the center of the universe. We still sort of look at everything and examine everything as if we are really still, the central piece in God's plan. Now, I could understand on a religious aspect, you can feel you have a special connection with God and that you are an important or even a central piece. But on a worldly aspect, that idea that we really need to understand facts as they are in the world, and whether, however we fit in God's plan, we have to understand the current moment as it is, with a little bit of objectivity. This is something that we're still struggling with, and we keep on struggling with. And this is one thing that, other than marshalling facts, I feel there is a need for something to be done, but I still don't know what it is. I admit, after I've been sort of like an activist for almost half of my life, and I'm a total failure. I have absolutely no idea. I haven't achieved a single thing that I can point. Hey, I haven't changed a damn thing, and the only thing I've learned is that there is so much that I have absolutely no idea about, in all my erstwhile certainties about certain things, not in the principles, the morality aspect, but the methods have been shaken.
Well, to flip it around, did you want to say something on that subject?
No, I mean, on the Holocaust itself and this denialism, I think we basically made the point that it's tied to Israel, obviously, the belief that the Holocaust is the only reason why Israel exists. And I think that takes us back to the point that we don't accept Israel and the Jews as natural to the region, which is a dramatic change. Meaning, when you go back to the 1920s, even looking at the Egyptian media, for example, I remember one of the first articles that began to change my worldview and discovered that history wasn't what we were being told was an Egyptian newspaper from 1917 describing the funerals of two Rothschild family officers in the British Army that had just conquered Jerusalem from the Ottomans, and describing them as dying in the land of their ancestors, where their people had fought their enemies to protect their homeland. All of that, there. At that point in time, when you look at the Faisal-Weizmann Accords, when you look at the position of various Egyptian intellectuals towards the idea of Israel and Jews, there was an acceptance of Jews as natural to the region, as belonging. Once that changes, once Israel is viewed as a cancer that is imposed on the region from the outside, there's a need to explain, okay, so why is that cancer there? And, okay, it serves worldly imperialism, becomes the narrative of Nasser and his regimes. But then there's also, well, it can't be just that. It's the Jewish control of the world and all these conspiracy theories that these people have. And it's the idea that the world has this guilt because of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust becomes the reason for our own misery, and thus we can never acknowledge it. And then, I mean, why does the world sympathize with them? It becomes annoying. I mean, don't you see our own people dying and all this narrative? There's this quote that I love. I read it in a book and a course I took about the Holocaust back at Georgetown in 2010. It's by a Polish historian, Witold Kola, when he says, in the past, the Jews were envied because of their money, qualifications, positions, and international contacts. Today, they are envied because of the crematoria in which they were burned. This idea that we can't allow them to have something that the world would empathize with, that I think is central to our attitude towards it.
So that would mean, and this is not unfamiliar in other parts of our contemporary world, that the latter is envy of the victim status, and that would then point to the desire really to be the winners in that particular.
We suffered more.
We particular
more died in our ranks.
Let me, and then we probably open it up to questions from our audience. But let me ask you two things, and I'm sure you've accomplished quite a lot, Ammar, in your life. Maybe not, you didn't get all the way to where you want to go, but that's my question. What would you like to see? What's your notion, and Sam too, I don't mean to exclude you from this, a healthy Middle East, a healthy Arab world? What would that look like? And what, if any, maybe there's nothing, but if any, the present foundations or roots of that might be that could be nurtured by things like this program and your other program, I mean, the weekly program as a whole. Yeah.
My hope is that we are able to be more self-reflective. We know that there were some wrongs were done to us by the outside world, by outside powers. But for crying out loud, we've done a lot of mistakes ourselves. Let's identify what we can actually change. Before I can dream of change in America and the international order and how they sort of play politics towards us, can I change my reality? This is more under my control, in a sense. So, and not criticize those who are self-reflective. So we need to take a closer look on our attitudes, on our mistakes, our culture, our history, and try to be more honest about it. A greater openness to critical thinking regarding our past and present is really an important first step. It's not going to lead to utopia. And this second idea, utopian thinking, please. I just want a slightly better life tomorrow for my kids, and that will be great achievement in itself. A way to handle the mess rather than an end to the mess itself, because I don't know of a way that can end the mess. And which is, reminds me always of what Churchill said about democracy, the worst form of government except for all these other forms. I'm not an advocate of utopia. And I think this is something also that we need to get rid of, is that we don't dream of a better life in the region. We always dream of a utopic life. it seems to me. We don't say it necessarily this way. We try to pretend we're realists. But when we eventually lay out the conditions of what we imagine the future to be, it's always a utopia. You know, it's not about utopia. It's sort of, there's an acknowledgement. We need to have an acknowledgement that the best we can achieve is a system of handling the mess, and that creates certain balances between the different communities and our expectations. So,
which would mean, which would mean in this case, accepting that you're not the center of the world.
Exactly.
I mean, this is a problem raised, you know, obviously by the very impressive past of in Islamic history, when Muslim polities, the Islamic world was the center of the world, and for a very long time, but no more. And
yes, and in a sense, this is, I mean, I'm always trying to sort of differentiate between how we examine worldly realities and where our religion tells us we belong in the world. We can believe, if you want, that yes, according to God, we are the center of His plan or her plan.
Watch yourself.
Yeah, you can believe that, but that the way you interpret that in your analysis of worldly events should really be far more nuanced, because if you look at history, none of us really belongs to the center unless they really are organized and powerful, and you know, they own the worldly means of making it a reality. I think one of the main reasons why Islamists are so focused on the US and hatred of the US is because the US occupies the world, the role of the Ummah in their ideology. Mm-hmm. It's the Ummah that should be at the center of the universe, a Muslim nation, not the US. So all you have to do is just call it the Islamic States of America, and lots of Islamists will be very happy with it, with all the things that are happening right now, because they feel power. It's about power and empowerment. And I think we need to think differently about empowerment.
I remember many years ago, a guy I'm no longer a fan of, or probably never was, Saad-Din Ibrahim. He had just come out of jail in Egypt after Mubarak had, taken him as a prisoner, jailed him for a while. And the American University in Cairo had an event for him there. And I went up and asked him, well, you see, the university is now celebrating you. It's the same university that would give my name to the state security as an activist, and they would have me on file and harm me and so on. How do you explain this? And he told me something that really has been a true statement of all your life in the Arabic-speaking world, you are in a small room and you push the walls. Don't have any illusion that you're going to break the walls. Okay? They're not going to be broken. But all you can do is basically push. If you can just push them a centimeter here, you're expanding the room for freedom for you. I think that's the goal of everything I do in my writings and of this program. I have no illusions that I'm going to change the Arabic-speaking world. I have no illusions that Egypt's going to become a democracy tomorrow, or that Muslims and Christians are going to love each other in these countries, or any of that. But all you can do is basically push and expand that room. And if enough people are doing this pushing, well, maybe you're going to get a bit of a better life for you. The other question I think that's there is, why should an American audience care about all of this? I mean, an American audience should care about the Holocaust for its own reasons, but why should it care about the question of the Holocaust in the Arabic-speaking world, or about anti-Semitism in the Arabic-speaking world? And here I think the issue is not minor. Sure, there are very few Jews remaining in the region to be harmed by any anti-Semitic acts, but that doesn't make the issue on the sideline. It's a central question to the advancement of the Arabic-speaking world, its ability to acknowledge reality. It's a central, without it, there's no potential for this region to advance if it cannot deal with the fact that, no, the world is not controlled by some powers behind the scenes, the Jews, the Freemasons, but we are responsible for our own failures. It's a central problem if we cannot acknowledge that the Jews are not some aliens that were implanted in our midst, that they belong to this region. These issues should be on the top of an agenda of anyone who cares about democracy, freedom in the Arabic-speaking world, and not just a side issue that Jews or Israelis should be caring about.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually, and to build on this, this is, once again, the way we deal with the entire issue of the Holocaust and the Arab-Israeli struggle. This is where I see a connection. But in a sense, it sort of boggles my mind that no one, especially during World War II, like people like Amin al-Husseini, for instance, the Grand Mufti and others, they didn't actually look at what's happening in Germany and Europe and say, you know what, now we understand a little bit why the Jews are coming to Israel, and we really, this is terrible in a sense. We understand we probably should do something that's accommodative, because in a sense, after 48, millions of Palestinians, well, not millions at the time, but now we have millions of Palestinians all over the world, citizens of the United States and Argentina and Chile and Australia and all over, and they are grateful to the states that took them in, and they're happy and integrated and so on, and yet they don't see, apparently, and not only them but a lot of Arabs see the inability of us to accommodate Israel. Mm-hmm. and Jews within Israel. When we have a problem, it's okay for us to immigrate to other people, many to other lands, and to ask for asylum and refuge and whatever. Now, some people will object here, will say, but the Jews came, they wanted to create a state and take our lands. Something you really need to remember, and this is where history is hidden, is that there was no state. We were part of an empire that fell apart, in a sense. Long ago, we used to go and immigrate to other people and take their land when there were, there is no state. But now, within the concept of an international community in the mid-20th century that emerged, there were states. Otherwise, I could easily imagine Arabs going and to Argentina or Africa or whatever, and wanting to create their own colony. They've done it before.
Argentina is a Lebanese colony.
Exactly. You can make that argument. You've actually had a Syrian president there for a while. But in a sense, the objective look at history, this is what we're really missing in the region, is that we keep condemning conquest and colonialism. And yet, when we look at Islamic history, we celebrate ours. To this very day, there are people crying for the loss of Andalusia. I remember, in fact, in the condemnation, you remember this, Sam, one commentator of Palestinian descent was making, after Trump announced that they're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, he made a long speech about it, and then he compared the Arab countries today to the princess of Andalusia who lost the Andalus. And I was looking, you are bemoaning the loss of a colony, basically, while you're trying to condemn colonialism and from your point of view. So it doesn't make sense for us not to realize how to deal with history in a more objective way, and to realize that up until this century, empires and colonies were sort of part of how people interacted with each other. And in fact, the unique thing about the 20th century and onward is that we finally established a system of states, and we are trying to protect the sovereignty of each as much as we can. This is a new thing. The concept of an international law is a new thing. Before that, it was really, in a sense, a free-for-all.
So, if I understand correctly, that the Holocaust, but also separately the question of the Jews and Israel, it's a kind of a quintessential example of the way in which thought does not function at the present time, in a way in which would be not only beneficial to Jews and Israel, but beneficial to the people doing the thinking. That you can't get this, if you could reach some kind of real sense about this, there would be a kind of prospect of thinking sensibly about a whole bunch of things, or vice versa. That it's really it's an issue that in the confusion, misrepresentation, as you said, the blatant self-contradiction goes to the heart of what's wrong about discourse and thinking and so forth. The other thing struck me in your account is that it's Sam's account or Saadetdin Ibrahim's account. Well, we won't talk about him at length. But the other thing is that pushing against the wall. I mean, when people of my age were little, when we were being foolish or obnoxious or something else, our grandparents, usually our grandmothers, used to say, "Go knock your head against the wall." And the point was, if you do that, you'll come to understand it's stupid to knock your head against the wall. And it would seem to me that what one would look forward to if people are knocking their heads against the wall is that they realize that it's stupid and there's a better way to do things. It's not even really pushing against the wall. It's trying to say, there's a wall there. There are these brute facts of life. Maybe some of them are harsh, some of them might be pleasant, but you just have to sort of, pay attention to them and recognize them and not imagine that they'll go away. And in that regard, it seems to me, that's why I was asking what you might, how, I don't mean specifically from this program, but it's the spirit of the program to cultivate this motion in the region. I mean, and really in the region. I mean, our audience is not us; it's people in the region. To whether there are things to build on. Some of them which are a product of really horrible things. I mean, exactly what has gone on in Syria should cause many self-reflections and much pause among people in the region and thinking about how did we get to this? How did we get to this?
In a sense, you can see that there are a lot of people who put a lot of thoughts since the end of World War II and until now into how we can, in fact, build a system of international law that can prevent us from asking this question: how did this happen again? How did we get to here? And in a sense, we kept on failing because of the lack of a political will. And it still is a question of political will because we, in fact, I think around 2005, when the doctrine, the responsibility to protect, was adopted by more than 130 countries around the world. And the strange thing is that members of the Obama administration, like Samantha Power, had played a role in fact, in pushing forward and advocating this policy. In fact, in 2004,
it came out of an experience in the 90s when we, so to speak, had a second Holocaust in Rwanda. So
exactly, it became Rwanda and the Balkan situation and Kosovo. So there was, and then we had in 2004 we had the situation in Darfur. And Obama himself was actually for intervention in Darfur at the time as a senator. So it's very interesting to see these people, when they finally came to power, reverse all of their thinking on the issue. Yes, you can speak about the curse of Iraq, and you can speak about also how they mismanaged Libya and so on. But at the end of the day, I think in Syria at one point the facts became so clear and apparent what's happening, and the scale of it became so clear, and you're already seeing by that time refugees going into Europe. So the need for action has never been more apparent, and yet they didn't muster the political will. They had a political vision that was completely antagonistic to this. They wanted to deal with Iran. So the question always is going to be, how do we influence policymaking in key countries? How do we muster the political will? How do we build an awareness among the general public of the importance of certain types of humanitarian intervention? And so people don't say, oh, imperialism is coming back, because the international system is deeply flawed when you have countries like that are authoritarian and willing to commit war crimes, like Russia and having a veto power and the ability to therefore stop any decision making. It's not easy.
But let me put it this way: has the experience of Syria led people within the region to say, how did we come to this, and what do we need to do to...
The key to my pessimism at this stage and my sort of current despair, I would say, despite my commitment to the struggle on the long term, is that I don't see it. That self-reflection that I spoke about, I don't see it. I think after 7 years of the situation in Syria and Yemen and all of the current mayhem unfolding in the region, I have not seen enough self-reflection among key figures, political and intellectual and religious, that can make me feel optimistic and hopeful. Oh, something is changing. This is good. We may not have won sort of the battle, but something is changing, and this gives me hope for the future. If anything, it's the old pattern reasserting themselves. It's as if, the momentary hesitation that happened in 2011 and 12, had been erased, and now, okay, it's back to familiar territory, and everybody is very happy, in a sense, that now they can still go back and talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict and condemn Israel and condemn America, and, this is the territory we grew up with, we're familiar with, now we can do it again. For a while, we had to change, and we didn't know how. So thankfully, now we don't have to change anymore. No, there is this inbuilt resistance to change that we have not overcome yet. This inertia, it's killing us.
So our first episode was about Syria and the future of Syria. We thought, okay, it's the major issue in the region. Currently, Ammar is Syrian. We cannot ignore it. I think it was the most one we got curses on prior to this one. I still don't know how many curses we're getting here. A lot.
Well, they haven't stopped. You only broadcast last Thursday.
The comments, I think the amount of this information about Syria itself in the Arabic media is phenomenal. In the Arabic media, I mean by this Arabic language media, and not necessarily by the regimes, meaning that Russia, for example, Russia Today, the Russia in Arabic, is unbelievably, has a presence in the Arabic media, spreads conspiracy theories on a daily basis. You see the stories about the Toyota cars that were found with ISIS, you can trace them to the US. I don't know what, the stories
My dealership on Rockville Pike.
Here. The same goes for the Iranian, not press TV, the Al-Alam Al-Yawm, which is the Iranian channel in Arabic. Again, they're very successful propaganda fronts. And they and the Syrian regimes, Mayadeen is the one, they have been very successful in spreading conspiracy theories, portraying Bashar al-Assad as the last, hero of resistance against Israel, as the last line of defense of secularism, all of these conspiracy theories and views. So
Does your average Sunni in the region thinks this finds this appealing, or?
That's the question. Does he define himself as Sunni? I think it's for Tunisian, for example, where the whole country is Sunni, basically. There are a few Jews and a few Shiites in the country. The dividing line is between secular and Islamist leaning. And when I visited Tunisia about 3 years ago, and the amount of support among secular Tunisians to the Bashar al-Assad regime, because they assume, okay, he's fighting the same fight we're fighting. The same would go, for example, for the supporters of the Sisi regime in Egypt, which, the regime itself has identified closely with Bashar al-Assad as a fellow regime resisting the collapse of states and all of this. And the segment of the population that supports the regime is also sympathetic with the narratives of Assad. You see it in former Egyptian diplomats writing on social media all kinds of conspiracy theories about the chemical weapons attacks, how it's staged, all of these. So I don't think Syria has meant that. But everything that's going in the region, I think, has made people a bit Okay, so what's happening around this? Islamism is in a stage of disorientation. The Brotherhood loss in Egypt, the fragmentation of the group following that, the collapse, the rise and the collapse of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So the main ideology of the region is in a state of disorientation. Nothing seems to be working. Okay, there's Dubai, but you can't replicate Dubai with 100 million people in Cairo, for example, in Egypt. So there are no models presenting themselves. You see it in forms of nostalgia, for example. There are, 6 million people who follow the King Farouk page on Facebook about the late King of Egypt. I mean, if you're going to choose a monarch from Egyptian history as a model, it's not Farouk, okay? I mean, the guy's a complete failure in anything.
No,
and yet why? Because there was a TV series that portrayed him nicely. There's this nostalgia for the cosmopolitan Alexandria, the real one and the imagined, what the people have built. I wrote about, for example, the new interest in the Jews who live in the Arabic-speaking world. There are about more than a dozen novels in Arabic, written to an Arabic audience, dealing with this question of Middle Eastern Jews, Jews who used to live in Egypt. I mean, there's an Iraqi novel, there's a Tunisian, there are a couple of Egyptian, there's a Moroccan, there's a Yemeni novel, all of these. So there's a nostalgia for a past, again, real or imagined, that we no longer have. When your present is as dark as the Arab present is, and your future looks as bleak as the Arab future looks, it's natural that you're going to look back to the past, to the Islamist past, to the cosmopolitan past, to some past as the only anchor that you have.
The other thing I actually want to sort of, so if I want to sort of build on this, a recommendation for myself and for Sam and for a lot of people who are dealing with the region is that there is always a lot of reasons to be frustrated. And at the same time, I don't want to see any idealist tendencies, nor our growing frustration make us fall for the fallacy and illusion of quick fixes. There are no quick fixes. It's a long struggle, and we have to accept that the only way going forward is to carve inches out of the stone, pushing the walls.
Push the walls.
Which is why even when we said that an intervention in Syria should happen, it was not a quick fix. I didn't anticipate it's going to lead to democracy, only that it was going to stop mayhem. And that by itself is good. Stop mayhem and curb an authoritarian regime to an extent. But it's not that it's going to produce democracy in an idealistic situation. That's why when I look at people who look at Libya and say, see what happens to Libya? Yes, of course, because the society was devastated by Gaddafi. The whole idea was to try to prevent the sort of a reassertion of authoritarianism by Gaddafi by any means necessary, and then you can look forward to another decade or two of stability that's going to produce mayhem down the road again. So we were never going to avoid going through this when you have a system that is based on destroying society in order to survive. So dealing with mayhem eventually, whether it's today or 10 years from now, is something we all need to prepare ourselves for, because the regimes that exist today are breaking the society down inch by inch and methodically, because this is the only way they can survive. They are not about modernization. They are not about renewal. They are not about introducing democracy from the top and modernizing sort of ala Atatürk. Hafez al-Assad had this chance in Syria in the 80s. If he wanted to be this moderator, he could have modernizer, he could have done it. He didn't do it because he didn't believe in his own legitimacy to do it. And he had no inkling. He had no inkling to begin with. So neither quick fixes are going to happen, nor any hope of these regimes and the stability they provide is going to produce anything. Sooner or later, this region is going, and other parts of the world, because of the nature of the existing regime, are going to go through a dissolution, through an implosion, and we have to deal with the consequences. There is no avoiding it.
Well, let me, before we go to the question and answer, let me end on this point. I asked for some starting point for the, so it seems to me that one has emerged. That is, it's called the Sam Ammar Show. And the sign that it's having some success is that, tens of thousands of people write in to attack you. So they want to have this quarrel with you, and maybe you will. I trust you will continue the quarrel and maybe make a dent in it. And I don't know, maybe let's say in 10 years' time, we'll come back to celebrate. We'll have you back before then, but we'll celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Sam Ammar Show, and then hopefully the 20th anniversary of the Sam Ammar Show. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll call on you in a minute, but first, I want to make clear that there are two things you need to do if you are going to ask a question. First of all, please state your name, and if you have an institutional affiliation, that would be helpful, and then ask a question. And if you don't, I may interrupt you. Okay. Right here.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss, a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy. And my question is, how much of the Holocaust denial do you think might be due to anti-Semitism based on religious beliefs? And also, have you thought of bringing this film to like Muslim organizations that are active in the BDS movement, like Students for Justice in Palestine?
Okay, I think anti-Semitism, the best works, Bernard Lewis's book, Semites and Anti-Semites. Before that, there was Ali Kaddouri's wife, what was her name? Sylvia Haim. She wrote an excellent article about the beginning of the anti-Semitism in the region. Funny enough, it didn't start among Muslims. Islam historically did not have a strong anti-Semitic attitude simply because the Jews weren't important enough. The main enemy of Islam was Christianity. It was the competing religion, both militarily and in terms of conversions and all of that. So while the stories of the Prophet's conflict with the Jews were there in the text, no one highlighted them, no one cared about them. The emergence of modern anti-Semitism in the region comes at the hands of French missionaries, especially the Jesuits, who begin to spread these ideas just before and after the Dreyfus affair, in especially the Levant, where it's the Christian Arabs, it's the Christian Middle Easterners that begin to buy into these ideas first. So the first text anti-Semitic tracts that you have in the Arabic language are all written by Middle Eastern Christians and not by Muslims. In fact, Rashid Rida, the leading Muslim figure at the time, in his Al-Manar wrote at the time of the Dreyfus affair, attacking the French. How could they be so racist and prejudiced in the case of Dreyfus? Of course, he's not a good guy. He changes his views and holds anti-Semitic views later. But the spread, I think, is first among the Christians. There's a Russian element. Russia at the time, there's a fight between the Moscow Patriarchate and the one in Constantinople, and in an attempt to remove the Greeks from control of the Arab churches, they foster the idea of an Arab identity. And as a result, there's a huge Russian influence. The protocols and others begin to go through the Orthodox communities in the Levant. The change, I think you can track the change of when it becomes Islamic, when it becomes widespread, by looking, for example, at how the Egyptian media dealt with the three major conflicts in Mandate Palestine. 1921, the Jaffa clashes. The Egyptian media is 100% pro-Zionist. In the late 20s, when you have the Wailing Wall clashes, the media is split. By 1936, when you get the Arab revolt in Palestine, the media is siding with the Palestinians. So it's during this period that you begin to see widespread anti-Semitism emerging and spreading among the majority Muslim population of the Middle East. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, Radio Berlin play a very important role in that, and then later adoptions by key figures, Sayyid Qutb and others.
I completely agree. The whole concept is new to the Middle East and to Arab Muslim culture, and it's tied to the introduction of nationalist ideas more than religious ideas. Yes, you can always go and find in religious texts and pick up a lot of interesting information that can justify your new anti-Semitic tendencies, But this information, these hadith and these traditions have been around for centuries and did not produce any sort of movement that can be classified anti-Semitic in Muslim societies up until now. So the question is, why now? Because of nationalism. So it's, but now in contemporary times, a lot of the, so you know, this is the historical aspect, but now in contemporary times, people don't know this history. They're not aware of it. And so most people are actually justified their anti-Semitic tendencies on the basis of religious grounds. And so right now, so now it is a religious phenomena for the most part. Arab nationalism faded. So the Arab nationalism then played a role in introducing the idea, and then now sort of religious fanatics are taken over, and it's become now justified and accepted on religious grounds. And that actually creates a moral sort of imperative on people, modernizers within the Muslim communities to tackle it as well, and tackle, therefore, these traditions that justify it. It's a tall order. This is difficult. Yeah.
I mean, I don't do marketing. I don't know what's the marketing plan for the Alhurra. I guess that's part of how it's done. It was natural to come to Hudson since I'm at Hudson here. I mean, it's aired to the Arab audience. We just did the subtitles for here, this audience, but the main target audience, the one that saw it on TV, the ones that sees it on our page and social media, is the Arabic speakers, and they're the ones that we want to change their hearts and minds.
But yes, in a sense, there is, I see, in fact, this program being aired in universities and other institutions and organizations around the country, around the world. I would want it to be, because the whole idea is for us to be able to break the barrier. So there is a plan being developed to promote it further. And, you know, Sam and I are always willing to go ahead and attend events like this, wherever they are held, in order to push the message across, because it's tied into a longer struggle. As I said, my introduction to this issue of the Holocaust was very early on in my career as an activist, because I always saw a connection between empathizing with others and peace building and democracy building. I see it as all connected activities. I do not see it as a separate compartment, because it's so controversial. Avoid it. Don't speak about it. Now focus on the issues of human rights in Syria and forget about this very controversial issue. It's the same thing that, for instance, a lot of human rights organizations in our region, they don't tackle, let's say, homosexuality, because this is so controversial. Speak about human rights, accept this. So it's always like this in our society. Speak about empathy with others, but don't speak about the Holocaust. This is so politicized. I don't see it this way. I think the issues that are always pushed to the side are the ones that need to be brought into the center. Otherwise, we're not going to gain anything.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Rob Satloff of the Washington Institute. First, if I could test Hillel's admonition about just a question, I do want to make a compliment. Is that all right?
Those are permitted.
Okay. I really want to compliment you. I thought this was excellent. This was informative and balanced and went really to the heart of the matter. And you know, I thought it was a fantastic piece of work. So congratulations. I want to. There's a lot I can ask you about, but I wanted to ask you about one item. I'm actually optimistic about what I would call the normalizing discussion of the Holocaust in Arab societies. And one aspect I want to ask you about is the new politics, the new Arab-Israeli politics vis-a-vis Iran. And because Iran is so closely associated these days with the state leader of Holocaust denial, thanks to the wonderful Ahmadinejad, how much that helps to legitimize Arab reasonable discussion of the Holocaust. And I tend to think there's an opportunity here to build upon. You had in your film Nasrallah. You know, it's Iran and its allies today are among the most virulent deniers, using all the different definitions of denial that you quite accurately pointed to. I think there's an opening here to take advantage of this, and wanted to ask whether you've come across that in your own discussions with people and your own discussions with Arab intellectuals on this issue.
I think there is definitely something happening in the region in terms of cooperation between Gulf Sunni states and Israel, cooperation that has become quite open, to say the least. I mean, they don't visit officially to Israel, but beyond that, we've seen even intellectuals that are tied to the regimes. The Anwar al-Ishqi, the former Saudi general, going to Israel, others like him. So I think there's definitely an opening on top. What I haven't seen is that reflected on society as a whole, meaning a message. Ammar said something in the beginning of the program while we were standing outside that I thought was very important, which is there are Arab intellectuals, for example, that have talked about the Holocaust in English. Doing it in Arabic is something very different. So Edward Said, for example, it was very easy for him to do it in English and talk, yeah, the Holocaust, and we acknowledge. But giving that message to the Arabic audience, I don't think...
Well, it was very hard for him to give that in Arabic because he didn't speak Arabic.
Yeah, I mean, he spoke, he couldn't read. Let's put it this way. He couldn't read Arabic, but at least he could speak the language. But that kind of message, I don't see anyone doing it in the region. Again, people like Mohammed bin Salman have come to the United States. He's met with Jewish leaders. Egyptian presidents have always met with Jewish leaders in the country and giving a message. They welcome delegations from AIPAC, from other organizations to Egypt, for example. But again, has that meant anything in terms of the educational system? Has it meant anything in terms of the media, the mass media, the propaganda that they give to their own people? I think it's something that, I mean, it's still a taboo. They're still happy to meet with the Israelis and plan what to do with Iran, but they're not happy to do it with their own people and give them that message. The other thing I think is that sometimes, again, I mentioned Tunisia before when I talked about the Sunni identity. Not everyone, we tend to overemphasize the Sunni Shia thing. It's a Gulf Levant story. It means absolutely nothing for an Egyptian. We don't think in terms of Sunni Shia because, well, we've had a Shia empire before rule us, the Fatimids. We're Sunnis, but we still go to Al-Hussein and Sayyida Zainab mosques to ask for God's help. It means very little in the North Africa in general, despite the Iranian attempts of infiltration, of conversion to Shiism, of all of that. So I think the Sunni Shia issue as a driving force for pushing Arabs to deal with the question of the Holocaust or opening up to Israel is limited geographically to the Levant and the Gulf.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things also that you have to see, this opening on the top is a bit cynical. It's designed to influence Western audiences again. I mean, so very much like the Arab intellectuals sort of in their address to Western audiences, you can have now Arab officials in their address. Western audiences also say, okay, yeah, the Holocaust happened. You know, we can visit the Holocaust Museum, and we promise you to do perhaps a museum in Saudi Arabia or Riyadh that can be visited by dignitaries to showcase our moderation. But I'm not really optimistic about how hard they're going to push this agenda as you know, in the educational systems so that they can reach their audiences, because it's going to be very controversial. I mean, if they cannot push women's rights issues, for instance, as strongly these days, it's going to be very difficult to push this as well. So I'm not necessarily, I don't read too much.
If who can push women's rights?
MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, because he's the one who's making these openings. So if he cannot, you know, be strong enough and brave enough to take a line on this women's rights issues, I think he's going to have difficulties with that as well. There's always going to be internal calculation. And he's right in some cases. You should be careful. He doesn't want to stir up and give his enemies sort of like weapons to use against him. But at the same time, it does make one sort of wonder about the sincerity, whether they reflect serious conviction. But even if the conviction is not sincere, there could be an opening, but it's an opening that should be not left to the whims of any particular ruler. There should be an external agency. There should be people, for instance, like us, who are doing the program in order to try to use this opening and make it real, and sort of take it out of the control of the ruling elite and subject to their whims, and so we can go and push it to the people and create a serious grassroots representation in this regard. And this is why it's important to connect the issue of the Holocaust and empathy with others to the larger problems that are facing us in the region, that this is a way of transforming the region to the better. This is not necessarily anti-Iran, but we have to protect ourselves from a regional power that is inimical to our interest as Arabs, for instance, or Gulf states. The problem with all of these scenarios is that there is a we here that's implied that we don't agree on yet. Is that, are we Arabs, Levant, Gulf, Muslims, Sunnis? It's not that there is no consensus on this. There could never be a consensus on this. And the whole idea is that, can we nonetheless realize we can be one with this diversity, create a system that accommodates the diversity, or are we going to always try to push for a unitary vision? We all have to be Sunnis against Iran. We all have to be Gulfis against the rest of the region. I don't know.
I mean, I would say there's just two exceptions probably to that I'm sure you're very familiar with. Morocco, where we've had visits by educators to Yad Vashem, to the Holocaust Museum here, exchanges. El Akhawin University hosted conferences in Morocco about the Holocaust before. And that's obviously encouraged by the monarchy itself and accepted by the regime, as well as individual initiatives in Tunisia, Manouba University, where again, there's part of an educational mission being done there by the people there to educate.
You have a new Jewish representative in the legislature, don't you?
They ran someone in the local council.
Yeah,
I don't know if he won or not. Not the right one.
First let me say I'm grateful to Rob for raising the question. Not to mention also his book about this subject. But it does strike me that arguments are one thing and experiences are another. And it's occurred to me, it has impressed me over the years of many years of visiting Israel and looking at the discussions about Israel. I'm not just speaking about Israel. That a large number of the discussions that take place about Israel take place in the absence of any experience of it. And therefore, they're extremely abstract. And if it's the case that some of this motion in the let it be, that it's just sort of the central Middle East, results in visits by people in the region to Israel, that might, I think, be a different thing. Whether or not they do go to the Holocaust Museum or Yad Vashem or not. Although, if they sign up for the tour, they'll have to go to Yad Vashem. So, and there's some ad hoc evidence for this. I mean, over the past, there were a couple of Saudis who found themselves in Israel. And I know by reliable report that one of them was a young person who was just completely astounded by Israel. It resembled in no way what he thought it was. And it was very attractive because he's a young person and the kind of person that MBS is hoping will find modern life appealing and seductive. So I think it's on that level, I think it's possible. And then the arguments, or if you like, the creation of a certain amount of empathy via the Holocaust might they might combine in some way. But the first step would actually, I really think, is probably something, and this would presumably have to come from the top. There would have to be permission from the regime to various regimes for their citizens to visit Israel.
Read Israeli literature, watch Israeli channels. All of that doesn't exist. I mean, the ultimate example of this piece from the top, I think, is Anwar Sadat. There's a very famous picture, at least famous in the Arabic media, of Sadat sitting with Diane. And I mean, Sadat is hailed as the peace hero, and he deserves praise as well, of course. But the picture focuses on Sadat's tie.
Tie?
Tie, because it has the Nazi symbol, the swastika, on it. And it's like, look at this Sadat, how good he was. Yeah, he fooled the Jews into returning Sinai, but he was true to our beliefs. That kind of mentality. And the kind of mentality that he himself obviously had by wearing such a tie. That tells you a lot. He was willing to do the peace treaty because he had to, because he wanted to return the land, but in his heart, he was still, in a sense, the same guy who, as a journalist in the 1950s, after they did the coup, he ran this propaganda newspaper, new newspaper, Al-Jumhuriyya, for the Egyptian regime. And a rumor had started, 55 that is, or 54, that Hitler was still alive and living in Argentina. And he penned a letter to Hitler, congratulating him on everything. And don't think that you lost, you really succeeded. That kind of mentality that's willing to do peace but is still anti-Semitic, that's what you want to avoid.
Yes, that's for sure. Yeah. Mina?
Mina Abdulmalek from the Holocaust Museum. I just want to make one point. It's not a question, actually. Thank you so much for the films. Great. Thanks for Hudson for hosting this event. Thanks, Robert Satlow, for your leadership on this topic. And I just want to mention that what you said, Ammar, exactly what the museum is trying to do. We have educational program in Morocco, Tunisia, and we are establishing partnerships in other places in the Arab world for Holocaust education. So I think in this sense, we are trying to push the walls, as you mentioned, Sam, and I share with Robert some optimism that although that I agree that most of the times in our region, the Middle East, when the top doesn't really care about the grassroots or letting other people to reach the grassroots, but at the Holocaust Museum, we've been very working hard to actually building partnerships with NGOs and people working with the grassroots.
Okay. Would you pass it? This lady here has been very patient.
Hi, my name is Grace Kang. I'm with the Institute for Korean American Studies. First, I want to say I strongly applaud this episode. I'm not a Middle East expert, but in 2000, I visited Jerusalem, and an Arab man struck up a conversation with me. I explained I was American, Korean American, and he rather quickly started telling me that the Holocaust was a big exaggeration. And he said, oh, maybe 1,000, 2,000 Jews were killed. And I started to argue back with facts, saying there were 9 million Jews in Europe and 6 million were killed, So I'm very sympathetic to Ammar's respect for the facts, but also discovered that it's usually politics that overrides facts. And so my question for you today is, to what extent do you think a two-state solution that was accepted by both parties as fair, to what extent could that help restore the memory of the Holocaust as it was factually?
One of the interesting things is that the peace process started after 91 in Madrid, and then a few years later, the Palestinian authorities was established, and Arafat went to the West Bank, and now the Palestinians, the PLO, is back, and in charge of the parts of Palestine that were supposed to be a state. Now, this is the Palestine that's going to be signing a peace deal with Israel. And yet, if you look at the educational curricula that have been in existence since that time till now, it's filled with anti-Semitism. So, and Holocaust denial. And this is a problem. So in a sense, I'm not really sure, because if you waste 20 odd years of the peace process and still wait until, well, we're going to have peace first and then we look at the educational system. That's not how it works. If you're really convinced of the need to live in peace with Israel, side by side, you have to prepare the grounds for it. You have to prepare the next generation. So if you're optimistic about the prospect of peace, you immediately work on the ground to prepare the next generation to be a generation that will sit down and will visit Israel, will work. There will be a lot of young people who need to work there, and there will be this peaceful exchange, because now we're accepting it's a peace process, not just we're going to have a Palestinian state and we're going to go our separate ways. It was always supposed to be two states, but that are connected economically and cooperating. So if you really believed in that, you needed to prepare the ground for it. And education is where you start. And they haven't started yet. To this very day, we don't see that kind of effort. So I think we really need to look at these issues separately, in a sense. There is something in our mentality, I don't know when is it going to change, that will always be anti-Semitic. And then the issue of peace is have to be looked at from a political angle. I think this is probably why peace hasn't happened yet, is because at the crucial moment, Israelis need to be able to trust that Palestine is not going to be used as a bridge to launch war by Iran or others against Israel and undermine Israeli security. And when they look at what the Palestinians are saying about them in school, in the textbooks, about what they say in the programs, in TV programs, they cannot develop that trust. And as long that we are unaware of the importance of that element of trust and empathy, I think peace will remain an elusive prospect.
I mean, I'm always hesitant to give an opinion about such a topic. Smarter minds than I have been working for generations now, attempting to deal with this conflict and to solve it with failure. Let me say Ammar, you talked about the need for education of this. In a sense, we, and I'll speak from my people's side, we went to the peace process with an idea that peace was only another means to get what we wanted to get by weapons, by violence. There was never an acknowledgement that we went to peace because it's impossible to get what we wanted to get through the violence, so we need to compromise. The idea was, we're going to Oslo, we're going to all of these initiatives, and we're going to end up with the same things we always wanted. We're going to get the state, we're going to get Jerusalem, we're going to get the refugees returning. There was never anyone courageous enough to talk to the Arabic-speaking people and say, no, we can't get these, and thus our goal, our end lines, the result we want is more limited. And because of that, the Arab street has never understood why we need to do any concession in the first place, because we're going to get it anyway. All we needed to do was just convince the world that we're nice people and do this non-violence thing, because, the violence wasn't getting us anywhere. So there was never, in a sense, the regimes never explained the situation to the people. I don't blame a regular Palestinian who's been told all his life that this is your land, you're going to get it all, you don't need to, there's no reason for you to compromise on anything. I blame the leadership, I blame the intellectuals in these countries of not explaining reality, that we went to peace because there has to be a compromise somewhere. I think we also need to acknowledge many people deal with the issue of anti-Semitism in the Arabic-speaking world as again, it's on the left, they blame it as a side issue. They hate Israel, so they became anti-Semites. On the right, they're anti-Semites because they're Muslims and Islam is that. I think there's a need, I'll make a controversial statement by saying people became anti-Semites first and then became anti-Israeli. And I'm willing to defend that statement historically of the development of the intellectual life and how they viewed the Zionist project. Anti-Semitism, the spread of fascist and Nazi ideas. We mentioned Jeffrey Herf's book, Nazi Propaganda to the Arab World. There are a lot of works about, and there needs to be much more studies, about that influence of fascist and Nazi ideas, about the links. We mentioned Goebbels' visit. We mentioned Hess. There are many others of these. Later, those that went and worked in the Arabic countries, and how anti-Semitism became so integral to the intellectual life that it became a stumbling block. If you really want to deal with peace, you need to deal with that issue even before perhaps you discuss borders or refugees.
Let me, occurs to me to add something on this, and it goes back a little bit to the first question that was raised. The question of the Jews in a Muslim or Arab context was, I think, as Sam or maybe Ammar said, for a very long period of time, there were difficulties. They weren't held in respect and so forth, but they were not important. They were, to use a phrase from a Jewish book, the despised religion. There's a very famous and great book from Jewish book from the Middle Ages called the Kuzari, which is written in Arabic, and it has as its subtitle, I'll say it because it rhymes, Arad wa Dalil fi din Adalil. It's a reply and apology on behalf of the despised religion. And in fact, that it is despised is an opening theme in the book. You can, from that perspective, and I grant you there were other things back in the tradition of the Hadith and so forth, but it wasn't, the really active hostility was towards Christianity because it was the great power. The problem that, one aspect of the problem that I think even generally has arisen is when it came to be the case that Jews were no longer despicable, maybe even needed to be envied or respected, this is a big problem. And it's a problem, I'm following here on Ammar's description, there are psychological problems or emotional problems here. How do you adjust to that? And you could fill it in with all kinds of arguments about whose land it was and so forth, but there's a kind of brute fact here that Israel is a successful and powerful country. And that doesn't really fit with the world as Ammar was saying the world should be. It just doesn't compute. And it has to be because it's turned out that, at least in Arab countries, that you can't wipe it out. You just have to come to terms with it. And I'm not sure you're right about Sadat. I think he could have worn that tie for his domestic audience without, but because there was something very deep about Sadat, and also a great sense of his own superiority to his. I remember when they were attacking him for going to Israel, he said, "All these people are dwarfs. They're not. They have no vision. They have no vision." And I thought but I won't. There's no way of proving this one way or the other. But that willingness to see Israel in that light, and therefore as a permanent and respectable reality, and one in where you might have something to learn from, that's a different. That's already a different order of perspective. And I don't think that's absolutely impossible for reasons that what Rob was saying before. It may be an accidental result of the fact that for the time being, certain Arab countries could use the assistance of Israel in a quarrel they have with someone else, and may need to get to know Israel more, and need, in the process thereof, see it in a different light.
there is something, an interesting aspect here that perhaps this is something that a lot of,
I'm sorry, did we go over the time limit? Yeah, okay. Okay. I'm sorry, what? We have to,
Yeah.
oh, okay, all right. Let me ask you to thank our speakers for their, and let me offer on their behalf their availability for further questions.
We're here.